Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the ITIC conference. In this session, there's a very special talk by Jessica De Largy Healy about our Due. And let me just say, first of all, a few words about Jessica. Dr. Jessica De Largy Healy is a French-Australian anthropologist who has worked in the Research and Higher Education Department of the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. After completing a PhD here at the University of Melbourne, and also in a co-tutel with the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris on digital archiving practices in northeast Arnhem Land. She undertook research on Australian material and audiovisual collections in European museums and archives. So Jessica and I have known each other for many years. I was one of her supervisors, but of course her main supervisor was the late Dr. Goombala. She has studied the many creative ways in which these materials have been reappropriated in their source communities. And next week she starts in a new position in France, a very prestigious position, the French title of which I promptly forgot. Chargé de recherche. Chargé de recherche. In any case, it's a full-time research position, highly desirable position in the National Centre for Scientific Research, or CNRS, and she will pursue a program on the anthropology of repatriation. So thank you very much, Jessica, for coming all the way from Paris for this very important event. But of course you would, I know that.
So I would like to start by paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose traditional lands we are gathering. It is a true pleasure to be back on this beautiful country. I am most grateful to the Australian Society of Archivists and to the ITIC Symposium conveners for their invitation. It is a real privilege to deliver this closing plenary to honour the memory of the late Dr. Joseph Goombala here at the University of Melbourne, through which we first met, in front of many of his former colleagues, family members and friends. I would like to extend special thanks to ITIC patron and guest of honour, Professor Marcia Langton, for her guidance as my former PhD supervisor and for her insight in sending me to Galawinku to undertake fieldwork under Joe Goombala's mentorship and care. I wish to acknowledge Dr. Goombala's family, members of whom have flown from Arnhem Land to participate in this event, Gaora Ganambar, his beloved wife and lifelong supporter, Farah Goombala, their eldest daughter, who has taken up great responsibilities in her community, and his brother Michael Mungola, a senior ceremonial singer and painter, who shared part of his journey from the homeland Jiliwiri to museums and archives across the country. I also have a special thought for two other of their brothers, Henry Jaringal Gaikamangu and Matthew Gaikamangu, both sadly now deceased. In the early 2000s, these elders entrusted Dr. Goombala with the necessary authority to begin his research on what the old man called their collections, the paintings, objects, sound and visual records belonging to the Gupapwingo clan, which since the 1920s have been dispersed among dozens of institutions worldwide. Transmission to the young generations, stuck in between two worlds, as they said, was central to their commitment to take action in new and challenging ways. The fact that we are here today to celebrate some of their achievements, some 15 years later, is a tribute to their pioneering vision. When Lyndon Orman Parker first invited me to give this plenary a few months ago, I felt both honoured at this opportunity and somewhat awed at the prospect of addressing such an expert audience, comprising many colleagues and practitioners who are currently working at the forefront of technological innovation. As the symposium speakers have demonstrated over the past 2 days, Indigenous engagements with information technologies are extensive, diverse, and remarkably creative. New media projects that we couldn't have conceived of 10 years ago are flourishing all over the country. In addition to the more classical knowledge management tools, such as databases, we are now looking at cutting-edge development in gaming, social media, and phone applications. My own experience of such matters started in the early 2000s, ancient times really, when we consider the speed at which these technologies have evolved. In 2002, Dr. Gumbula and his two late brothers, together with Richard Gandoy Garawura, an important leader of the Galawinku community on Elcho Island, became the founding directors of a new local organization called the Galawinku Indigenous Knowledge Center. Funded through the former NT Libraries and Information Services, this pilot knowledge center was established to host an experimental Yolngu digital archive. As part of a collaborative research agreement signed between the University of Melbourne and the Town Council, I was charged with assisting the group of men in developing this project. In those days in Galawinku, computer literacy was scarce, to say the least. Digital media were just making their way into people's lives, and it is hard to believe today when you walk around the community, there were no mobile phones, no Facebook, no YouTube, no Bluetooth. The internet had only recently become accessible in a handful of community organizations through unstable and slow broadband and satellite connections. While very few people had any experience of these technologies, the advent of new media in the community carried great promise for a cultural future, as anthropologist Eric Michaels had put it in the context of Central Australia, where he had been working 2 decades earlier. With the successful Ara Iricha archival model created for Anangu use, digital archiving project appeared as a promising tool for the empowerment of Indigenous groups, especially for those living in remote areas of the continent. Our collections have gone and never came back, the directors of the Knowledge Centre used to say to explain their predicament after decades of outside collecting. Northeast Arnhem Land occupies a particular place in the history of Australian Indigenous museum and anthropological collections, partly because of the long and continuous research tradition that characterizes the region up to this day. Since the American anthropologist Lloyd Warner's seminal fieldwork in the late 20s, only 5 years after the first mission, Milingimbi was established in the region, in what was then an Aboriginal reserve. In excess of 50 researchers and collectors have worked in the different communities and homelands of the region. In addition to a huge corpus of ethnographic records, photos, films, sound recordings, field notes, transcriptions, disseminated through various institutions, the region is renowned for its bark paintings, thousands of which have been integrated in museum collections as far as Europe and the United States. And we have heard of some of these collections earlier this afternoon. The old man's aim was to have these collections returned to the land where they came from, emphasizing that this would be a means of encouraging them to start talking again. With the establishment of the Knowledge Centre as the first local technological hub, their ambition to start this dialogue of a new kind with their collection soon became a reality. As we well know, the uptake of information technologies in Indigenous communities is not a recent development in Australia. The BRACS broadcasting system, the Tanamai video conferencing network, or the Ara Iricha Cultural Archive are some well-known early initiatives that are a tribute to this rich history. For Indigenous groups in other parts of the world, as well as for anthropologists working in the field of information and communication technology, Australian Indigenous communities are quite avant-garde in their repurposing of information technology for their own cultural usages. Increasingly since the late 1990s, in the wake of the decisive Museum Australia policy framework, Previous Possessions, New Obligations, collaborations between museums and Indigenous communities have led to new forms of engagement with information technology, especially with respect to the digitization of collections and processes of digital repatriation. While the technologies at the heart of these collaborations continuously change, one thing that does resist obsolescence and that is most interesting to consider retrospectively is the conceptual work that has gone in each specific situation into thinking cultural heritage through technology. Dr. Gumbula's intellectual legacy looms large in this respect. Professor Aaron Korn gave us a moving account of Joe's remarkable career this morning, so I won't repeat it here. I would just like to reflect for a moment on the particular conjunction which made his legacy all the more salient for us, who are involved in developing uses of information technology in Indigenous communities. As he began working as a director and liaison officer at the Galawinku Indigenous Knowledge Centre, Dr. Gumbala's trajectory as a Yolngu Liangaramiri, or ceremonial expert, took on a decisive academic turn. His work as a scholar and researcher became more formalized with museums and universities through a range of collaborative schemes and prestigious awards and grants. The relationships Joe established with many curators, academics, librarians and archivists very much influenced his conception of digital archiving. At the same time, his work at the Knowledge Centre brought him the opportunity to combine the theory with the practice, as he said. His research in collections and archival institutions, his work on the Knowledge Centre digital archiving project, and his ongoing responsibility as a ceremonial leader concerned with the intergenerational transmission of that knowledge. Drawing on Joe's early insights into the digital archiving of Yolngu knowledge, I would like to share a series of 4 defining moments in our common journey, which have helped me appreciate both the greatness and the complexity of the task ahead. The first of these moments, which occurred during a debriefing session following Joe's first visit to a European museum, provides the gist of my argument on the value of repatriation and on the usefulness of considering these collaborative processes in terms of a circle. The second defining episode concerns an inspiring visual model Joe created to demonstrate the intimate link that exists between knowledge and performance. The last 2 moments I will present both worked as ethnographic epiphanies for me, in that these events came to be powerful illustrations of the processes at stake in digital repatriation. Paradoxically, I will show the work carried by Dr. Gumbala to foster museum collaborations and digital repatriation invites us to look outside of the archive. What I mean by looking outside of the archive and the significance of this approach for our understanding of Indigenous engagements with information technology will hopefully become clearer as I continue. So I will start with the expression, the circle of the art world, which I use in the title of my presentation. It was coined by Joe to describe the digital repatriation of cultural heritage from distant institutions to his home community. This expression epitomizes in subtle ways what is at stake in Indigenous digital archiving projects beyond the purely technical side of things. The idea of a circle is suggestive of a continuous flow, in this case, the continuous flow of Yolngu knowledge. The movement starts with the ancestral beings, the creators who in the distant past instigated that knowledge through their foundational deeds in specific expanses of land and waters. Its circulation continued through his forebears, the men and women who gave form to that ancestral knowledge by interpreting it and recording it in multiple media, in song, film, painting or sculpture. Through trade, sale and various forms of exchanges with missionaries, anthropologists, filmmakers, collectors and other visitors, this material expression of knowledge traveled to the institutions where they have been kept to this day. In the current context of repatriation, the expression the circle of the art world takes on a more political overtone. With the sense of knowledge going full circle, it implies the return of the materials to their place of origin, to the people to whom they belong. Thus, when the knowledge comes back in a digital form, a new cycle can begin. And in recent years, many of us have witnessed how these old records have in turn generated new creative forms through contemporary interpretations in art, as we will see with the Giliwiri, or as we saw with the Giliwiri film clip, and the ceremonial domain, as I will show in a moment. Joe's use of the notion of the art world to designate the sphere in which the past and present expressions of ancestral knowledge circulate conveys well the aesthetic sense in which these materials are held by present-day Yolngu. Museum collections and archival records are valued as tangible traces akin to ancestral footprints, luku, in Yolngu Mata, that were purposefully left by the ancestors in outside institutions for their descendants to follow. Together, these traces are seen to form a pathway called Dukar in Yolngu, a global pathway which Dr. Gumbula regarded as his personal destiny to track and follow. Walking in the footsteps of the ancestors is indeed a very important Yolngu principle. In the ceremonial context, it means enacting the movements of the ancestral beings to renew their creative acts. In the context of digital archiving practices, it means reconnecting with cultural heritage and adding new layers for future generations. Dr. Gumbula first introduced the idea of the circle of the art world during a filmed interview we carried out in 2007 in my mother's garden in the French Jura region. This interview had followed a research trip we had undertaken with Aaron Korn at the Museum der Kulturen in Basel, Switzerland. As the recipient of an Indigenous research fellowship at the University of Sydney, Joe was able to study, document and photograph significant missionary collections dating back to the 1920s and 30s. The first time he had raised the issue of digital repatriation of this material to his community, the then curator for Pacific Collections had asked him fairly bluntly, "Why do you want to have these objects back? Is it because you lost your culture?" Our interview was partly set up so that he could formally address this question, which we felt reflected quite well the uninformed and mildly dubious position that prevailed in the European museum context at the time. And let me add here that it has changed since then, so that was 10 years ago. I will now read you Joe's long response, and I'll read that at length. As I always do when I quote him directly, I have kept the editing to a minimum, as I think his use of English makes a compelling contribution to his arguments. And for those who were in the previous session and who saw him speak in the film that Louise showed, he could speak for half an hour, make really long statements. So this is part of it. So, quote, "I was asked in Europe something like, why do you want to have these photos? Why do you want those images of the paintings back to your community, back to Australia? Why do you want it? The law has already gone or disappeared? You lost the law? What have you done in your community all this time? Are you missing something? The links, missing something, you know, like missing generation or lost generation through the aspect of the art world?" Well, it's not that. As today, Yolngu are so strong. They've got a full culture that still lives on. Their paintings still live on, their dances, their stories, their everyday life, what they do in the community is so strong in Northeast Arnhem Land today. So, to get to that question, the answer was yes. I would like to bring this back to the community, and we have to negotiate in a proper understanding to take a copy. We won't take the originals, you can have the originals, but I will take the copy with me, digitizing it and taking it back to the community. And the people will say, yes, this is to show that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, or 70 years ago, you know, some photos are from 76 years ago, it disappeared from the eyes of the Yolngu people. It disappeared. So this is the time to start to do the research of my own, from my knowledge to explore and try to get to those paintings back to the community. Not the originals, but the copy of the paintings, and take them back to the community. So there is a difference between 20 years ago and 60 years ago. It's to understand what materials, what facilities they used during that time. Because now we've got two worlds, two techniques to use for paintings. So I think it is very important. And it brings back the memory back to the community to fulfill that cluster. You fulfill into that knowledge system as well. You bring it back to the community and it delights you, it lightens you up again. It feels your spirit is back again. You know, that is the main focus that I'm looking at in my research today, to bring that material back so it will start to perform, whether it is in the objects or in a photograph itself or just in a video or a DVD. So bring that material back and show it to the people. It is welcoming the older people coming back again to the land, to the place where it started from, where it came from. That is very important too. It is restoring that memory again. Because we make things around us, we make them feel free, feel like they are being with us. The spiritual people are being with us. and we perform them and they perform us. So we work together in that aspect. So we bring that in. Something of value has been taken away. So if that value comes back to the place where it belongs, then we have a ceremony, and that makes people happy and joyful. It talks again. We talk to that object again, you know. We make him feel free, make him feel not locked up in a small box or in a dark room. And that is very important. See what we do in our everyday life. If we perform something that was done 70 years ago, we are there. We witness our own affairs, our own identity, our own respect to the objects. And we are practical. We do it every day. It is part of us. We work together. That's when everybody is smiling. That's, you know, when kids paint themselves, kids dance to young people, women, and to the old. Everybody is dancing to that way. That's the law. That's the unity. We are bringing something to the community, and that's when we perform a ceremony. End of quote. Those of you who have had the opportunity to work with Joe will recognize the passion and verve with which he spoke of his work and of the question of repatriation. For an anthropologist such as myself, it was nothing short of exceptional to work with such an eloquent person who, through his words, could literally transport you in his vision. While there would have been many threads to pull from that quote, I would like to draw your attention to one specific aspect which seems to me of utmost significance for us here, who have gathered to discuss Indigenous engagements with new technologies. This specific aspect can be condensed in the sentence, "We perform them and they perform us." To me, this idea of a mutual performativity between the ancestors, the objects, and the people rests at the heart of the digital repatriation processes we are engaging in. This is why, far from fixing information and on databases, from freezing knowledge on computers, the value of repatriation lies, as I suggested previously, outside of the archive, as it stimulates creativity in ritual, artistic, and other domains of practice. To emphasize this point further, let me present you with a second defining moment that powerfully demonstrate the interconnectedness between archive and performance. Some of you may have already seen this painting, so Aaron showed it this morning without going into details. And I won't go into full detail because we could spend 2 hours discussing the complexity of this painting, but I'll just give you a run through it. So this painting was created by Dr. Goombala in 2002, and he used it extensively throughout his career in university lectures, conferences, museum consultations, exhibitions, and publications. Before I delve into its complex workings, I will just outline for those unfamiliar with the Arnhem Land context some basic features of the Yolngu knowledge system. As in many other Australian Indigenous groups, Yolngu religion is characterized by a revelatory system of knowledge. Knowledge expressed in songs, stories, paintings, or ritual objects, and by extensions in the new media representing these things, photographs, digital images, audiovisual recordings, and even some anthropological books. This knowledge is not free and publicly available. Sacred knowledge is part of a sacred endowment, as it was famously described by Nancy Williams. A sacred endowment made by ancestral beings to specific clans or land-owning groups. Thus, knowledge contained in paintings and other objects, even public outside knowledge that everybody can see during public ceremonies, for instance, is owned and controlled by specific groups. Access to certain kinds of knowledge is restricted to specific categories of people on the basis of clan membership, kinship, gender, and ritual status. To explain the intricacies of the Yolngu knowledge system, Joe devised this conceptual map, which he called the Yolngu Knowledge Constitution. It was initially conceived as a blueprint for the Knowledge Center database to reflect differential access rights to the information repatriated from museums. Painted on a large canvas, which was later digitized and recolored to draw out the traffic light analogy that you can observe here, this model is both complex and ingeniously pedagogical. As a conceptual tool to think through the implications of digital repatriation to Indigenous communities in Australia and beyond, this model has been a source of inspiration throughout my own intellectual trajectory. Through its vertical partitioning, the model shows how Yolngu knowledge flows through public, restricted, and secret domains. From the public or outside domain, called Garma in green here, to the secret, restricted, or inside Ngara domain of knowledge in red here, where in his words one needs to proceed with the utmost care. These names of or levels also correspond to the different ceremonial grounds, which you can see on the painting, that are consecrated to host different types of ceremonies. The horizontal partitioning shows the social distribution of knowledge between the two Yolngu moieties, named Dua and Yericha, which are on both sides of the painting, and between a set of interrelated clans who all have differential access rights to a particular body of knowledge through specific kin relations. So, for example, two groups who stand in a mother's mother, sister, daughter's child relation, or Mari Gutara, grandmother, grandchild, will have primary responsibility towards each other's land and ritual corpus, which will give them specific rights of access to the other group's knowledge. A few months after he started working at the Knowledge Center, Joe added a second painting to this one, thus creating a new montage, which he asked me to collate on the computer. Oh, and sorry, here's just a quote which was reproduced in a catalogue of an exhibition he was a scientific advisor to in Geneva. So I tried to negotiate a proper awareness and to inform people about the three domains of understanding that we have in the Yolngu world. I had the idea to use a universal sign, the traffic light, to explain how Yolngu knowledge works. The green color is for the public knowledge, what we call the Garma. The orange, Duni domain, is semi-restricted knowledge, proceed with caution. And the red, Ngara domain, is for secret knowledge, restricted to initiated person. People around the world use the same traffic light sign so that they can easily understand this model. And as I said, this model was indeed used in many different museums and publications. So the montage I was talking about is this one here, where you can see the first painting underneath, and on top of it, there's a new painting which represents different body designs of the Gupapwingu clan, his own clan. These designs, which all have specific meanings, are produced during different ceremonies, from the public to the secret men's ceremonies. These ceremonial body paintings are matched here to the age grading rituals. They mark the life cycle of a Gupapwingu man, from the first initiation of the little boy and to the old man on the far right, so from the left to the right. By superimposing the two paintings, Joe was explicitly making the link between the structure of Yolngu knowledge system and the performance of that same knowledge in real life. And to me, this matching of the two paintings was a very, very strong illustration of that. Let's now briefly consider the implications of that link on the community as digital records were progressively repatriated from museums to the Knowledge Center in Galawinku. This will be my third defining moment, which illustrates this circular notion of we perform them and they perform us. Through vision and contact with people, the museum objects could start to perform anew. The spirit being, or Mokoi, Morayana, who's just here in front of us, came to be a powerful embodiment of this process. During his first study of the Arnhem Land collections in Museum Victoria, Joe found representations of Murayana on two barks, and Lindy Allen told us about one of these barks in her talk before. So one bark was painted in the 30s by his father's father, Ngarich Ngarich, and one produced in the 1950s by his father, Jawa. The repatriation of these paintings as digital images and the circulation among the descendants of these two men, so Joe took copies of these paintings and brought them to Milingimbi to show all his brothers there. So this repatriation gave rise to a series of ceremonial initiatives led by the three branches of the large Gupapwingu clan. So Ngarich had three sons, which we saw on one of the photos that Lindy showed. The descendants of these three sons all came together The clan united behind the figure of Murayana, a being that represents their common ancestors, both ancestral, the spirit being, and historical, their grandfathers Ngarit Ngarit. After having organized a large Marajri exchange ceremony, which hadn't taken place in Milingimbi since the 1960s, it is as Murayana that the Kupapuingu led their first spectacular participation in the Garma Festival in 2004. Murayana is coming to Garma was the slogan on everybody's lips. Finally, I wish to share a fourth and last example to raise some of the issues that we can expect when engaging in Indigenous knowledge repatriation projects. It concerns a research project that I carried out some years ago at the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris. The project involved redocumenting part of the Karel Krupka collection of bark paintings held by the museum from the perspective of the painters' descendants, the sons and daughters of the painters, most of whom still live in the Milingimbi community. After meeting with Joe in Galawinku to discuss this project, he requested his brother, Michael here, to assist me by introducing me to the rightful descendants of the painters. People, I soon found out, were not at all interested in discussing the subjects of the paintings. That is, what ancestral being is it? What myth is it? What place does it represent? They were most interested, however, in determining who had inherited the rights in particular paintings and whether people still painted the story in the same way or differently. As part of the project outcomes, I wanted to leave digital copies of the bark painting collection on CD-ROMs, including one for use in the Milingimbi school library. For this to happen, I first needed to establish that all the paintings were public, that is, viewable by small children. One painting by Joe's father, Jawa, posed a specific problem in that all the people I showed it to had something different to say about it. No one paints like this anymore. I can paint like that because it's my father's painting, and no one should see this painting because it's restricted, were some of the different responses that I received. After having followed the line of kinship, by speaking to the sons of the painters, to the men of another branch of the clan, and to the managers of the other moiety, I resolved to take the digital photo of this specific painting off the CD that I was going to leave at the school library. About 2 hours before my plane departed, as I was paying a final visit to the art center, I noticed the same painting stacked among other artworks produced for sale. The painter, another son of the original artist, from his first wife, had recently painted this specific design on the chest of a young boy for his first initiation, which is a public ceremony. In Yolngu terms, the painting had thus become outside, in the public. It was agreed by all that it was indeed his prerogative to make this decision. The painting was public after all. This example is important in order to grasp some of the methodological challenges that can surround the digital repatriation of museum collections. This is a plea for the importance of fieldwork, which is necessary to understand the knowledge politics at work in the source communities. For museums, this also requires understanding that the degree to which an object or image is secret or sacred may vary from community to community. Its status may also change over time, especially if ceremonial practice still plays a role in that community's life. This final case also enables me to tie together both Joe's concept of the circle of the art world and the point I have been making about looking outside of the archive, as new layers of meaning are added to old material through their reinterpretation in ceremonial performances and new artistic forms. So to conclude, seen from France, where I'm now based, the linkages that have been established in Australia in recent years between archives, images, collections, and Indigenous knowledges, which was the theme of the conference, and the research collaborations these linkages have entailed between institution and source communities are way ahead of what has been happening there. Whereas a decade ago, Indigenous archiving and digital repatriation practices were still regarded with suspicion by many fellow anthropologists and curators in Europe, it seems that nowadays, even the most conservative institutions, such as the Musée du Quai Branly, have realized the potential of information technologies to foster new kinds of relationships and knowledge around their collections. A year ago, I was thus approached by a research team of Wayana, an indigenous group from the Amazon in French Guiana, who had secured funding to reconnect with and study a large collection of material culture held at the Musée du Quai Branly. The SAWA project, which is Indigenous Knowledge, Wayana and Apalai, two different groups, is the first of its scale to take place in the museum. It is led by 3 older men, a middle-aged man and a young woman. The group are working on the development of an online cultural portal, and they initiated contact with me when they heard of my past experience in Aboriginal Australia. They asked me to give them a presentation on Aboriginal digital archiving practices. They were most interested in the evolution of these practices over time, which models were created, what had succeeded, what concerns had been raised, and how these concerns have been resolved. The most moving moment for me was when I told them about Joe's research, how he had traveled the world alone to visit distant museum collections. Alone, was one of the group cried. He did all of this alone. While Joe was never completely alone, having secured the support of many friends and colleagues over the years, his path was very much one of a pioneer, who took it upon himself to act for the future of his people. It took quite an exceptional personality to achieve this, and I think that all of us here who have benefited from his guidance and vision would agree that he was one of a kind, the sort of person you feel blessed to have crossed paths with, and indeed walked with him for at least part of his journey. As we have heard repeatedly over the past 2 days, Dr. Gumbala's legacy looms large over our academic and professional circles as fellow researchers, anthropologists, museum curators, librarians, or archivists. The necessity for museum and archival institutions to engage in long-term relationships with Indigenous communities is one of the important points that was raised during the Makarata ceremony, which was the ultimate project Joe worked on, literally on his deathbed. The result of an ARC-funded collaboration between the Australian National University and Museum Victoria. So Louise Hamby spoke about this before. This peacemaking ceremony between the Yolngu from Milingimbi and the institutions holding their collections mobilized in August 2016 some 30 delegates from Australia, Europe and the United States. The fact that all these people gathered in the tiny township on Dr. Gumbala's own ground speaks for itself about the high esteem in which he was held in the museum world. I rest assured that his footsteps will be followed by many, in Australia but also in the institutions he visited in Europe and America over the last 10 years of his career. He has literally brought to life the collections that he has researched, and in doing so has changed the ways in which they are understood, cared for and valued for those responsible for them.